Welcome to Indigenous Knowledge Databases. My name is Marina and I'm the President of the Australian Society for Computers and the Law. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this event and to start by acknowledging the Uluru Statement from the Heart. The first paragraph of the statement states that our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands, and possessed it under their own laws and customs. This their ancestors did according to the reckoning of their own culture, from creation, according to the common law of time immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years ago. On behalf of all joining today, I acknowledge and pay our respects to all First Nations people, their elders past and present, and celebrate with you the richness of their laws, culture, customs, and traditional knowledge gained over 60,000 years, and their sacred link to land and nature. We'll have a small glimpse into this majesty today with our speakers as we explore the web of issues that arise when knowledge is digitized and stored in modern databases. We're very pleased to co-host this event with the Asian Pacific Copyright Association and have the distinct pleasure of having their president, Professor Natalie Stoyanov, moderate today's session. We also thank our sponsors, Spark Helmer Lawyers, represented today by their partner Dalvin Chen, for providing this platform to enable this most important conversation. Today we'll hear from leading experts in the field of Indigenous knowledge, databases, sovereignty protocols, and even the future of food. Amongst other things, we'll explore the legal, cultural, and scientific aspects of the collection, storage, and use of Indigenous knowledge. We have circulated detailed bios on each of our speakers, but as a quick introduction, our panel will be moderated by Professor Natalie Stoyanov. She is Professor and Director of Intellectual Property at the Faculty of Law at the University of Technology, Sydney. She is also Chair of the Indigenous Knowledge Forum Committee, a member of the UTS Commercialisation Advisory Panel, and co-convener of the Technology and Intellectual Property Research Cluster at UTS. Dr. Margaret Raven, a Yamatji Nyungo woman from Western Australia, is a Senior Scientia Lecturer at the University of New South Wales, Sydney, within the Social Policy Research Centre. She is also a part of the Environment and Social Group at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at UNSW. Dr. Raven is a geographer by training with experience in food insecurity related issues within urban dwelling Indigenous communities and many other exciting research projects. Please do follow her research online. Jerry Turpin is a Murrumba man, an ethnobotanist, member of the Australian Tropical Herbarium and recently established Tropical Indigenous Ethnobotany Centre, which is a partnership between James Cook University, the Queensland Department of Environment and Science, CSIRO, and other government agencies and organisations. Thank you, Jerry, for joining us today. Dr. Diana Burgeva is the Centre Manager of the Centre for Advanced Food Engineering at the University of Sydney and an Inclusion Research Fellow at the Curtin University Sustainability Policy Institute. She is an interdisciplinary researcher focusing on alternative proteins, novel food processing techniques, and generational consumer behaviour questions. Or she has also investigated food sustainability and harmonisation, for which she has won several awards. We're very glad that you have joined us also in the audience. And if you have questions for our panellists, please put those in the Q&A function. We'll endeavour to answer as many of those questions as possible in the time available. As you'll feel, as I feel, this is just the start of a conversation, and we look forward to you joining us for many in the future as well. Natalie, it's now over to you. Thank you for moderating today's session.
I'd like to actually do an acknowledgement as well. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So I would like to do an acknowledgement because you know, we're all here from different parts of Australia and all different nations, Indigenous nations from around Australia. And I come from two places from this point of view. So I'm representing the University of Technology, Sydney, the Faculty of Law there. And from their perspective, we pay our respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose lands and waters we're working, and to their elders, both past and present. But in particular, I would also like to add that the Guringai people of the Daramurugul or Darug Nation, from where I'm actually currently joining you this session, and pay respect to their elders, past, present, and acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of country and knowledge for this place, and hope that this evening's presentations and discussions will shine the spotlight on the significance of Indigenous knowledges and cultural heritage, and why protection is so important for current and future generations. The next slide. So today we're going to be covering off on three different areas, I suppose you could say. We're going to start off with an actual case study, a database case study of Indigenous knowledge. Then we're going to move on to a discussion about protocols and free, prior, informed consent in relation to such databases. And then the third aspect of it will be looking at the question of accessing these databases on mutually beneficial terms and how we're going to achieve that. And so Indigenous knowledges and cultural heritage have been recognised for their significant contribution, not only to the health and well-being of Indigenous communities around the world, but also to natural resources management, pharmaceutical, biotechnology, food technology sectors, and of course, arts and cultural production industries. So model regimes for the protection of Indigenous knowledges and cultural heritage against misappropriation often require the development of databases and registers as key components in the operations of these regimes. But in addition, you have the GLAM sector, namely galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, have digitized such Indigenous cultural heritage, and that raises issues of consent and control of those collections and for whose benefit. So the legal issues around these things are enormous, and particularly around the question of the creation, maintenance, the use of these databases, many issues around that, ranging from copyright on the one hand, and here you're looking at copyright in the databases themselves, and other forms of intellectual property rights, particularly in relation to the actual data that has been recorded. And then, of course, the use and establishment of those databases, how have they been created, under what basis, what arrangements have been put in place in the first place. Then the issues of Indigenous data sovereignty come into play, as well as protocols and governance. And on the issue of data sovereignty, I'd like to say that we tend to talk about data sovereignty generally as being an understanding of the data that is actually subject to the laws of the nation where the data is being stored. Now, that's an important thing to keep in mind, how it's been developed over time. But the problem is, of course, when we're talking about Indigenous data, then we need to think about Indigenous data sovereignty, which perceives rather where the data is being stored, what's more important is where the data has come from. And so in that sense, we're considering the fact that that data that is in the database needs to be subject to the laws of the Indigenous nation from which it is being collected. So that's an important distinction to keep in mind. If we could go on to the next slide, please. So I thought I'd give a bit of an overview of some of the issues from a legal perspective, from the international perspective, in fact, legal perspective, that raise questions around databases and Indigenous knowledge. You can see on the bottom left-hand side, I've got a number of different issues to put in there. Databases and registers being key components in model regimes for protection of Indigenous knowledge and cultural heritage, and also for the purposes of being a key mechanism for preserving culture for future generations. But where does this all fit in from an international legal perspective? Well, there have been many decades of discussion around this, and many different forms of conventions and international agreements and treaties, etc. But some of the ones that you can see on the slide there are very much key to why we're talking about this now and in such greater detail than we ever had before. So starting off with the Convention on Biological Diversity back in 1992, there was a recognition there that traditional knowledge of traditional peoples and local peoples is something that needs to be carefully protected and encouraged and dealt with in a way that hasn't been considered before. In the past, quite often we would consider traditional knowledge, or Indigenous knowledges in this instance here, as being part and parcel of the rights of humanity to that knowledge about the environment. Well, the convention changed that perception and introduced the need to actually provide appropriate rights and recognition of that knowledge. And that then led to the establishment within the World Intellectual Property Organization of the Intergovernmental Committee on Intellectual Property and Genetic Resources, Traditional Knowledge and Folklore back in 2000. And since then, they have been trying to develop 3 separate sets of model laws to try and actually achieve this protection and recognition. Meanwhile, we've had, from a different front, the Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage in 2003 under the auspices of UNESCO. And many countries are part and parcel of that, and they're recording their various forms of intangible cultural heritage. Unfortunately, Australia is not a signatory to this particular convention at this point in time. However, I'm aware that they do try to keep up to date with the details there and actually provide information to UNESCO in that respect. Then, of course, we have the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007, which we eventually signed. And that in itself is an important document which really outlines the rights of our Indigenous peoples as well, in particular, in relation to the question of their knowledges and culture. And there I particularly refer to Article 31, which talks about the rights of maintaining, controlling, protecting and developing cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, traditional cultural expressions, etc. And then finally, the Nagoya Protocol to the Convention on Biological Diversity in 2011, which provides a blueprint for nations to be able to actually achieve these ends, and one which, again, Australia has signed, but has not implemented at this point in time, but we live in hope. I think that the more work that we do in this space, the closer we get to implementation. Next slide, please. So what are the issues? Well, I've mentioned them beforehand. There are many issues. One of them, of course, is the idea of the legal architecture around such a database and what sort of governance do we have in place for that. Then, of course, there are the protocols that require understanding of how to establish, how to use, how to manage these databases, and then the rights of the Indigenous peoples whose knowledge is actually being recorded in these databases. How is that impacted? Are the communities themselves creating these databases? Are third parties creating these databases, and how have they come about? Then, of course, we have the tension between the copyright in the database itself versus the rights over the information, the knowledge that's recorded in that database. Important issue to grapple with. And then you've got the digitization of Indigenous cultural heritage by the galleries, libraries, archives that I mentioned before, museums and government institutions. Again, raises issues of consent and control over these collections and for whose benefit. Next slide, please. So to give an example of an extensive database that has been created, of course, is the Indian Traditional Knowledge Digital Library. It was established to basically cover the different traditional forms of medicine that are practiced and have been practiced for centuries in India. As you can see, it's documented a significant number of formulations in the different forms of medical systems and has been translated into 5 international languages. And why is that important? Well, it's important because this database is then utilised by patent offices around the world to establish basically the status quo of the type of medicinal formulations, processes, manufacturing processes, etc., that then form the prior art to potential inventions into the future and have been utilised as means of actually knocking out potential patent applications that are trying to plays a pattern right over an existing form of Indian medical treatment. So this is an example of how these databases can be utilised, and this is a national database that has been created by India, which is then utilised in that process. And as you can see, there is regulated under confidentiality agreements. Next slide, please. So Australia has been working on this for quite some time now, and IP Australia in particular has, for about the past 6 to 7 years, has been really focused on this question and established its issues paper in 2018, trying to identify all these different issues that you see up on your slide. So what is it that we're talking about when we say Indigenous knowledge? What about the question of misappropriation of Indigenous arts and crafts? Then there's the misuse of Indigenous languages and clan names, the recording of Indigenous knowledge and managing legacy recordings, the misappropriation and misuse of traditional knowledge, and the misappropriation of genetic resources that have associated traditional knowledge or Indigenous knowledge, and of course the questions of secret and sacred knowledge and protecting them from harm, and then the need to find a coordinated approach to dealing with all of this. And so that then leads us to our next presentation. Next slide, please. So Jerry is going to be talking to us about the experience that he has at the Tropical Indigenous Ethnobotany Centre, and in particular the Australian Tropical Herbarium, and all about these amazing databases that are being formed. So please take it away, Jerry.
Sorry about that, I had to mute myself. As you can see there, I'm an Barbara and traditional custodian from the Atherton Tablelands. I also have familial links to Wajunbari Dingi and Nudgin on the Tablelands as well, and Pukataipin on Cape York. So I'm just yarning to you from the Australian Tropical Herbarium at James Cook University, the Smithfield campus. This is the homelands of the Irukandji people, so I acknowledge the Irukandji people as traditional custodians of this area on which the herbarium is on, and I pay my respects to the elders past and present as well. And I extend that respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island peoples that are taking part in this webinar, and to the custodians of the homelands that you reside on. Next slide, please. So just a short outline, won't take too long. Just some info about the Ethnobotany Centre, work that we do, what is Indigenous knowledge, and then a little bit about ancient and modern databases. Next slide, please. So that's the Tropical Indigenous, or the Australian Tropical Herbarium building, of which houses the Ethnobotany Centre. This is a joint venture between Department of Environment and Science, James Cook University, and CSIRO. So the staff in that building is employed by either of those three entities. I'm employed by Environment and Science, and I guess go to the next slide, please. So the Ethnobotany Centre was established in 2010 after a workshop with custodians from around North Queensland, other scientists and herbarium specialists, and policymakers that were also interested in ethnobotany, and they came from around other parts of Australia. Throughout that workshop, the participants identified that the establishment of an ethnobotany centre that could be a valuable means of supporting traditional owners in the conservation, management and communication of their ethnobotanical knowledge. Since then, we've worked with many, probably around about 60 ranger groups, traditional owner groups, individuals, and also schools and the educational departments like that. Next, please. So the aim of the Ethnobotany Centre is to assist traditional owners in recording and documenting, protecting and managing and maintaining their biocultural knowledge. And there's just a couple of projects that I've been involved in. The Whanayalji mob from around the Daintree area, just recording their bush tuck and bush medicine plants. My dad's there, Wajinbata elder and Pukataya Ban elder as well. There with Poe from Poe's cooking show, and the guy there that's blocked out was Poe's camera, and he's since passed away. Next slide. So there's some of the ethnobotanist activities that look under 4 themes. So number 1 is research. Just a little bit about there with the Quanjimal and Yui Burra people from around Mackay there. They own that, or their areas, their headland around Mackay. And we looked at the bush tuck and bush medicine plants that were in the area. But we also chatted about climate change and what, if sea level rise does happen, what would happen to their country and to those plants and resources that they own there. There's 2 other current main projects that we have. It's a bush tucker project with the University of Queensland. Less than 2% of our mob are involved in the bush tucker industry. So this one is about developing novel root and other vegetables and giving custodians a kickstart, get off the ground. They want to do with their bush tucker. The other project is with the Australian Institute of Health and Medicine at James Cook University. They're researching the properties of Umbaba medicinal plants. Next slide. One of the activities is training and education. So, as I mentioned before, work with many Aboriginal groups, and we teach plant identification and collection, talk to school groups about science, encouraging Indigenous kids to get in the science path, and conferences and seminars. That one there pictured is traditional knowledge owners from around the world at Belém in Brazil, talking about traditional knowledge and their protection of traditional knowledge. Next slide, please. The third activity we do is collation of existing data and collections. So I just go through old botanical textbooks and journals, old newspapers, and collect knowledge out of there that's been hidden away for a long time. And that there's an example of some words that describes our plants on Mbarban country. So that's from the Royal Society of Queensland Journal from 1907. And we've only got about 300 words left in our language. So, those few extra words are valuable to our mob. Next slide, please. Also, we talk about intellectual property and protocols and agreements to the traditional owners, and mainly to inform them of their rights. Talked about the international obligations, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the Nagoya Protocol, Convention on Biological Diversity. So in there, it's mentioned Indigenous people and their rights to practice culture and country. And then, the Biodiscovery Act, which is about research on biological material. And in there, it mentions Indigenous people and protecting their knowledge when it comes to research on their resources. Next slide. So recording of Indigenous knowledge is urgent. Elders pass away. Skills are being lost. The knowledge and skills are being lost. So maintenance and preservation of Indigenous knowledge and cultural practice is becoming urgent now. When people pass away, well, a lot of that knowledge disappears with them. So it's important that we record and then teach the following generation so that they can keep it alive. Next slide, please. So what is this knowledge? You've probably seen papers talking about traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous ecological knowledge. I think that's just Western society trying to put a name to it. But we as Aboriginal people know it's more than just knowledge about the biodiversity. It's more of a holistic knowledge where everything is connected to something else. So, you know, when I record plants, the videos, they talk about that connection to that plant. So it could be spiritual or could be taboo. Sometimes plants can be ancestors, or there's some law attached to it regarding age and gender. So, it's about putting people in with that knowledge. It's that connection that cannot be separated. So it's knowledge that encompasses people, language, and culture in their relationships to the environment. And Christie says it's a mode of knowledge production which has evolved to allow human beings to fit into rather than outside of the ecology. So Aboriginal people was there within that environment. They were part of the furniture rather than being separate from that environment. Next slide, please. Biocultural diversity, that's a link between culture and diversity. Writers have said they found out through their research that there's a direct relationship between the loss of cultural diversity and the loss of biodiversity. So, and then other writers have also said that biodiversity hotspots turn out to be managed in some way by Indigenous people. So there was always that connection to country. Land, culture, and country are intertwined, same as language, and they cannot be separated. Next slide, please. So this knowledge, biocultural knowledge, that it's actually really highly detailed and complex, and it's survived accurately for thousands of years. Ancient culture were able to maintain so much information about, you know, the species of the plants and animals and other landscapes, the stars and the planets, without writing it down. So this knowledge was stored in the minds of elders, and it's prompted by songlines and landscape dances, art, and Lynn Kelly has written a book about the memory code of how Aboriginal people have actually learned how to memorise these thousands of information within their minds. Next slide, please. This is the database that I started off with, just an old Excel spreadsheet. And in there, you know, it's just recording the knowledge. A lot of this information comes from the old books, textbooks that are researched, that I've spoken about before, and it's put in there. And when I work with traditional owners, I just look through and see if there's any information that's relevant to them, and then I hand over that information to them. And a lot, you know, grateful for that knowledge, as you know, in a lot of cases, a lot of knowledge has been lost. Next slide, please. This is one of the databases that I have been using as well. So started off as language-based by a person in New South Wales, and I use it as a database for plants, and it's a language database, and it's not connected to the internet, so you know, it can just sit on your desktop. You can put lots of information in. It's got protection as well, so certain people can access certain knowledge within that. Put in photos and audio recordings and video recordings, and I'll promote this one because it's easy to use, and it could also be used as a teaching tool in multimedia techniques and learning how to record and edit your recordings. Next slide, please. So this was a pilot project that we had with the Atlas of Living Australia. So the Atlas of Living Australia is an online repository of information about Australian plants, animals and fungi. So it pulls together all that information from multiple sources, so herbariums and online platforms like WildNet, things like that. So it combines all that information and puts it onto the one platform so that it can be easily accessed. So the Atlas of Living Australia, we're working with a few Indigenous groups and just looking at bridging the boundaries between traditional and contemporary Indigenous knowledge and Western science. So the project with the AUSCL people was firstly about recording the information. It was the first time that they went back onto their homelands for a long time. They were awarded about pretty much a large country on the Cape York. They went back and they just wanted to record the knowledge again and just collate it and just put it into some sort of database for themselves. And then they worked with the Atlas of Living Australia and CSO researchers, and they talked about what knowledge that they would want to put on a public database. And at this time, they decided, well, they just wanted that knowledge for themselves. And then later on, they will decide what knowledge that they will put on the database. So, you know, they're the gatekeepers of their own knowledge, and they have a right to do that. But there are others that have put their knowledge up on the Atlas of Living Australia platform. Next slide, please. I think that's it.
Thank you so much, Jerry. That was a very interesting presentation. It just goes to show just so many things to think about when these databases are being created and also being used. And what I thought was really interesting about what you said was how to look at the question of what is Indigenous knowledge and the fact that you need to look at it from a very holistic perspective, which unfortunately under intellectual property rules, we tend to break things up into what can be falling under patent law, what can be falling under copyright law, etc. And we really should be looking at it from a much more holistic point of view. So thank you for explaining that. That now brings us on to our next presenter. Mary Margaret Raven will be talking to us about protocols and the governance issues around these databases. Thanks very much.
Hi everyone. I hope everyone's well wherever they are in this amazing country. So I just want to recognise that I'm sitting on Gadigal, Bidjigal and Guigal country near Kamay, Botany Bay. I'm Yamaji Noongar from Western Australia on my mother's side and Aotearoa, New Zealand on my father's side. And as most people know, or those that don't, we do this as a part of protocol. You know, we introduce ourselves, we say where we sit, and we acknowledge country. And that's a way of everyone knowing who we are and what places we're connected to. I'm a senior scientific lecturer at UNSW at the Social Policy Research Centre, and I also sit with the Environment and Society Group. And I also want to acknowledge that I'm working on an Australian Research Council discovery project called Indigenous Knowledge Futures with Professor Daniel Robinson, and he's also at UNSW Environment Society. And this work is looking at implementing the Nagoya Protocol, including supporting communities in Vanuatu, the Cook Islands and Australia. So working specifically on ABS agreements and protocols. I won't talk too much about that, but I may dip in and out of talking about perhaps Vanuatu and the Cook Islands. So I want to talk to you about protocols, but I'm so theoretically driven. I do work on the ground, but I'm fascinated by protocols. And I think everyone else should be too. And the reason I think everyone else should be too is because, you know, in the 2014 outbreak of the Ebola virus in West Africa, it showed us the significance of protocols. It showed us the need to establish them, what happens when protocols are breached, the effectiveness of them to curb diseases. These were all crucial aspects of the response to disease. we are now in the midst of a pandemic, COVID-19, and there's been a lot of media reporting about protocols and our lives have been influenced by it. Now, obviously, there's a bit of a murky water between what is a protocol, what's a rule, what's a piece of legislation. But, you know, on a daily basis, particularly if you're in New South Wales, you're being asked to wear a mask when you go inside, you're being asked to sign into stores, digitally sign into stores. We've just come out of quarantine, there were lockdown suburbs and border restrictions. And these are all part of like a broader suite of regulations for controlling something, which is what a protocol is. But even with these measures, people circumvent protocols and the viruses spread. So protocological, which is a term by Galloway, response to disease outbreaks indicates the importance of protocols, but they're not just used in diseases. They're used to protect Indigenous knowledge associated with genetic resources. They form the basis of computer networks. They are a part of scientific procedures. They're used in medicine and psychology, occupational health and safety, the military. They're used pretty much everywhere. Once you start looking for them, you will find them. So why protocols for Indigenous knowledge databases? So as Natalie indicated, part of working in this space around Indigenous knowledge and databases is the existence of the Nagoya Protocol on access to genetic resources and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from their utilisation to the Convention on Biodiversity. So that's the Nagoya Protocol. And then specifically Article 12 calls on parties to support the development by Indigenous and local communities of community protocols to protect access to traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources. And that's the work that that Daniel and I are doing particularly in Vanuatu and the Cook Islands, where we're supporting communities to codify their customary laws and practices around access to traditional knowledge and associated genetic resources. But what exactly are protocols? And I think it's important for us to take a step back and think about what they are and how they operate, because I think that's going to influence how we think about them in terms of databases. So for those who aren't theory junkies, strap yourself in, you're in for a ride. So protocols are assemblages for flexible control. So by an assemblage, I mean there's little bits that pull together. They're not just uniform, they're made up of lots of different things. They're socio-technical devices, and they enable a particular style of regulation. Galloway and Thacker, who work in science, the sociology of science, or so SST, I forget the acronym, sorry. Protocol's a contradiction, and the contradiction at the heart of a protocol is that it has to stabilize in order to liberate. So the idea of a protocol is that you need a set of rules to guide participants around or systems around what it is that they're doing, but the rules can't be so rigid that there's no flexibility. When you're working with people, particularly around traditional knowledge, there has to be some flexibility because things change. People change, the way you want to access the data, who has access to the data changes, and there needs to be some flexibility to enable that. So protocols, I'm going to give you some examples across in terms of the way they're used in Indigenous research and in the sociology of science. So in Indigenous research, they're considered as etiquette, guides, rules or rules of engagement, standards, prescriptive tools, rights-based approaches to affirm self-determination, agents of change, and a form and source of private law. They are also the way to embed customary law and practices, to embed free, prior, informed consent, and to embed access to a thing, whether that thing be a specific plant or whether it be the knowledge associated with that plant. There's been some really interesting work on protocols in other areas, and the metaphors that have been quite useful, I think, is that protocols are also considered as like a recipe or a vehicle or a set of road rules. In terms of biodiversity conservation, protocols are a statement of values, intent and action from Indigenous peoples and local communities. They're a way of embedding or linking customary law and state law. So in Vanuatu, and in the Cook Islands, what will happen is when the customary law has been codified into a protocol, it will be recognised by the legislation in those countries, and that legislation is set up to ensure that they meet their obligations under the Nagoya Protocol. But as parks, I'm happy to provide some references after this. Community protocols, Park says community protocols need to be understood as long-term process, not short-term events. So they have a time dimension. So when you set up a protocol, there is an expectation that they are not going to be the set of rules that will always apply. There will be some flexibility around it, and there's an expectation that the protocol will be updated. One of the communities in Vanuatu in the north have a song cycle, and they sing their protocol, and that song gets updated throughout the year or yearly. So protocols are about creating connections. As you know, as Jerry said, land, culture, country, and language are intertwined, and that's what protocols do. Is they bring together people, plants, animals, genetic and biological resources, belief systems into a regulatory relationship that can be understood by the systems that we have. So they can be understood by the use of databases, or the use of international law, or state law. So I just want to take a step back to like a protocol as a recipe. So when you think about a recipe, what do you think? So like a recipe, a protocol often takes the form of a sketchy instruction which leaves considerable discretion about how it is to be followed on any particular occasion. They go beyond meals as they set out the lists of requirements and actions to prepare a meal. I might skip some of this stuff, sorry. In terms of making, thinking of protocols as recipes, it's the act of making a list is the rationalization of knowledge that makes it possible to replicate procedures. So that it means that when you can see what the procedures are, you can replicate them and you can transfer them from one database to another, or one context to another. The protocol as road rules comes from Galloway's work, and they argue that, actually I might just give you an example that they have given us. So they say that it's a way of embedding voluntary regulation. And they say that many different combinations of roads are available to a person driving from point A to point B. However, en route, one is compelled to stop at red lights, stay between the white lines, follow a reasonably direct path, and so on. These conventional rules that govern the set of possible behaviour patterns within a heterogeneous system are what computer scientists call protocol. Thus, protocol is a technique for achieving voluntary regulation within a contingent environment. In computer networks and databases, protocols perform a specific function when it comes to Indigenous people or peoples. So the need for protocols in databases are based on both social rules and technical rules. So remember I said that they were socio-technical devices. When we think about protocols for Indigenous people, the social part, which I guess could also be a technical part, but the social part is understanding that Indigenous people have customary laws and rules and practices, and there's no slides, sorry, I'm just talking without slides. So there's a question in the chat. So Indigenous people have customary laws and rules that determine access. And so that's the social part of it, is understanding how, based on customary law and based on free, prior, informed consent, how should we or how ought we access the traditional knowledge? These social parts can be written down into a document that sets out the rules that people must follow. So it could be attached to the start of a database. In research, it is part of an ethics process. But there's also the technical aspect around protocols. So in the context of databases, I'm going to refer to the work that that Associate Professor Jane Anderson and Associate Professor Maui Hudson have been doing through local context. So that's, if anyone wants to look it up, localcontext.org, so context with an S on the end. And they have established these things called traditional knowledge labels and BC notices. So they looked at the system of databases and went, how do we actually do this in practice when we get to a traditional knowledge database? So TK labels are digital markers or tags that define attribution, access, and use rights for Indigenous cultural heritage. Each label is adapted and customized to reflect ongoing relationships and authority between, including proper use, guidelines for action, or responsible stewardship and reuse. So that's the social part of the socio-technical part of the protocol. The amazing example that they've got quite a few examples, but one of the amazing examples they give is in the use of the Passamaquoddy tribe in Maine. The use of these wax cylinders recordings that were made in March 1980, and they're held in the US Library of Congress, and they include the ancestors singing the songs. And if anyone wants to go online and have a look at it, it's at the video that's the start of this is pretty amazing. So they've gone into the record. So when you go into a database, there will be a record. They've gone into the record and they've updated it to include traditional knowledge. There's 3 TK labels, but also behind that is the digital infrastructure. So when we think about protocols, we are thinking about access rights, but it goes beyond that. As Associate Professor Jane Anderson, who's at NYU in Anthropology and Museum Studies, so she argues that digital infrastructures are not neutral. Digital infrastructures carry the bias of all of the other systematic frameworks around them. And then when you want to add Indigenous protocols and rules, there is not a field for that, so you have to create a new field. So you're essentially rebuilding the database from the inside out. You are creating some of the code. So the code has to change. You have to create new fields. And as Professor Maui Hudson, who's at the Faculty of Māori and Indigenous Studies at the University of Waikato, I've said that wrong, sorry, argues, if you start to create the infrastructures that enables this sort of provenance information to be done, then you start to encourage and support researchers who want to do the right thing or to do the right thing. It essentially forces upon people a system of, or maybe force is not the right word. It enables researchers to do the right thing without having to think too much about it. So it just becomes a part of the system, and the traditional knowledge is embedded in the database. And if there's any access rights, that will include it as well. How am I going for time? I might just add a little bit more. The other bit which I think is important for people to understand is that once we set up protocols, we cannot assume that people will follow them. There's this whole idea that we are rational beings, and yes, we are, but we are, oh, am I over time? Okay, I'm over time. I'll come back to that. I'll talk about it in the, I'll talk about it in the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Miri. I just wanted to raise the issue, I suppose, the question of protocols in the way you've described them, of course. Very much, they tend to be a voluntary process, don't they? And so part of the problem I think that we have today is how do we make them part of everyday use and that they're mandatory in engaging with Indigenous knowledge databases, for example. And I think that's where we need to have legislation that embeds these things, which we currently don't have to any great degree. So that's something we need to think about more carefully, I think, into the future. But thank you very much for that really comprehensive engagement on what protocols are and how they need to be framed to actually have impact. So thanks for that. So now we're going to move on to our third speaker, Dr. Diana Borgeva, and she's coming to us from the Centre for Advanced Food Engineering. Please take it away.
Thank you, Natalie. Hi, everyone. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Kurungay land on which I'm joining you today and pay respect to the elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. I accepted this invitation from Marina Yastrebov from the Australian Society for Computer and the Law with excitement because They always give opportunity for presenting a diverse perspective on things. From a social scientist perspective like me, researching future food alternatives and consumer perceptions, I would provide, quite frankly, an additional perspective to what was discussed before me. At the Center for Advanced Food Engineering, future food is an integral part of our work as we look at emerging technologies and develop some of these technologies. And through the Center's 3 research teams, Food for Health, Future Food Engineering, and Food Safety and Quality, we promote sustainable food systems that support good health and nutrition. Next slide. Let me tell you where the foods are heading. We all know there is increasing concern about the negative impacts of the modern food system on human and planetary health. There are many challenges that we are facing right now. We know we have a growing population that is going to reach close to 10 billion in 2050. And we can't continue to increase our land use. We don't have a second planet to populate. So we need to grow more from less. And you can see that with the growing population, we are going to need around 70% more food to feed everyone without irreparably harming the environment. So it's a big challenge we need to think about overcoming. This is why the food produced should be affordable, convenient, safe, nutritious, and sustainable. Nowadays, the emphasis is placed on how processed foods can be redesigned to make them healthier by altering the nature and structural organization of their component or ingredients to modulate the way they behave inside our bodies, in our guts. This includes reducing the levels of undesirable food ingredients such as saturated fat, salt, and sugar, as well as incorporating health-promoting ingredients such as vitamins, minerals, bioactive compounds, prebiotics, and probiotics. Foods are being designed to be masticated and digested more slowly, or to release their components at particular location along our gastrointestinal tract, which may help to fight chronic diseases such as obesity, heart disease, and diabetes by reducing appetite. Next slide. Right now, academics, researchers, and industrial scientists are using the fundamental principles of chemistry, physics, biology, and engineering to create a new generation of food using a variety of technological approaches. In these efforts, Australia First Nation people should be an important part, and we have to work together and properly use their sustainability knowledge. Australia is packed with native plants, herbs, spices, animals, and insects that have many applications and benefits which can be utilized into the creation of our future food. And with respect to ancient First Nation food culture and their connection to the land. Advances in food science, ingredients, characterizations, food engineering and processing and production have resulted in a wave of new alternatives to animal proteins as we know it. This is including plant-based protein, plant-based meat products like burgers, sausages, mincemeat, chicken, designed to replicate the sensory experience, texture, and visual appearance of the traditional meat, to taste, smell, and bleeds like a fresh meat. Native plants like mauga, Mitchell grass, and kangaroo grass, you can see on the slide, wattle seeds, can successfully take place into the novel plant-based food alternatives ingredients for their wonderful nutritional properties. Grind mauga seeds have nutty taste and can be transformed into an edible paste similar to peanut butter. Kangaroo grass is primarily used in making flour, which has a distinct nutty flavor, and the grass seeds taste like a fresh green pea. Wattle seeds, the edible seeds from Australia's many wattle species, are known for their high nutritional value. They're high in protein, zinc, magnesium, calcium, iron, and selenium, and have creamy and nutty flavor. Australia is a global hotspot for seaweed biodiversity with a rich diverse indigenous history dating back 65,000 years, including an extensive traditional knowledge of Australian natural resources. Seaweed and the most popular bull kelp you can see on the screen are used by indigenous saltwater Australians for a variety of purposes, not only for food, fishing, medicinal uses, but also for cultural activities, ceremonial activities, for clothing, shelter, and domestic uses. Recovering and conserving indigenous Australian knowledge and customary traditions surrounding coastal resource use is very important, because the development of algae protein could be the next thing, big thing, such as for creating vegan meat or other food. It is well positioned as being an aquatic plant. Algae does not compete with any other plant agricultural crops resources, both in terms of land and freshwater requirements, and around 50% of atmospheric oxygen is provided by algae. Also, the ecological knowledge of the First Nation people, and this is again related to the databases and the protocols for using these databases. Natalie, Margaret, and Jerry talk about. This knowledge has the potential to enhance a developing Australian seed wheat industry by guiding species selection, preparation, use, and sustainable resource management. Another approach that is being actively pursued in the alternative protein market to reduce the potentially negative impact of animal-based food on the environment, and an opportunity close to the First Nation hearts and traditional knowledge to consume insect-based food. Have you eaten an insect? Have you tried a nice crunchy cricket or a juicy witchetty grub? I'm sure the majority of you probably straight away switched toward experiencing the so-called yuck factor or disgust. It is understandable for societies with no tradition in insect consumption, but Australia is not exactly one of them. Australia is among the few countries in the world that have 60 native edible insect species available, traditionally consumed by First Nation people. Earlier, I talked about the manga seeds, but the manga roots are home to another important bush food, mako or witchetty grub, which may, for your surprise, taste like chicken. Despite being native in the past, a major component of the Aboriginal diets, the traditional bush tucker practices eating insect is not common for the rest of the Australian population. The First Nation knowledge will be greatly appreciated, as many species of edible insect are a rich source of both micronutrients and macronutrients. And also, humanity is actually already eating insects. They were historically a part of our diet and still part of the current diet in many continents across the world. Within the non-traditional protein category, insects are the largest and fastest growing protein type. And the fact that there are more than 2,000 insect species, mostly collected from nature and consumed worldwide by 2.5 billion people, is remarkable, and highlights the fact that eating insect is not inherently undesirable to human. But the market, especially in the Western countries, remains small in absolute terms. Cellular agriculture. Some biotechnology approaches are also being developed to create alternative food sources to animal products, which are often referred to as cellular agriculture. Cultured meat or in vitro meat or clean meat has its benefits. It is grown from animal cells in a bioreactor under optimized conditions such as oxygen, light, and temperature that promote cellular proliferation without the need to kill any animals, which obviously has ethical advantages. In relation to traditional Aboriginal food sources knowledge, kangaroo meat is chosen by an Australian cultured meat startup company, Vole. The founders are focusing their efforts on creating exotic meats. Not sure how Aboriginal, Indigenous people will react to this. Cellular agriculture is also being used to create foods using numbers of other approaches, nutrient-rich microbes, such as some bacteria, fungi, and algae. They can be grown in fermentation tank as a food source. We have to regain the knowledge of the First Nation food and true food culture of Australia, and to incorporate this knowledge into novel future food alternatives to be truly relevant to the Australia we live in now, and a fully inclusive Australia. We need to have a more Australian Indigenous plants in our food. You can go to the next 3 slides, please. Indigenous Australia uses native plants for nutrition in a precise way for healing. Australian native plants food, they can be truly reevaluated and used in diversification of our diet as functional nutraceutical ingredients in natural activities. You just saw some of the wonderful foods and the wonderful sources that we have. You can go to the next slide and the next slide. Yeah. All of this knowledge is needed to be included and utilized in the creation of our future food, in contributing, being part of the alternative proteins uprising trends. And you can go to the next slide, because I know that, Australian company AgriFutures estimated in their 2019 report almost 20 billion value, of which 3 billion is for the alternative proteins category. Some prognoses are released last year in the Food Frontier report, in the CSIRO. They also confirmed there's 3 billion for alternative protein category. Same trends are across all novel food alternatives. The latest predictions are that most meat will come not from dead animals. Some United Nations World Bank commissioned 80 Kearney analysis predict a growth in the alternative market with 41% for the cultured meat, another extra 9% for the novel vegan meat replacement, and CSIRO predicts 8 billion growth for the insect market. Similar is the situation about the algae market. And we can go to the last slide. The new protein landscape is changing every single day with new companies emerging. You can see on the slide what variety we have. 2-3 years ago, in each of these categories, you could still count them on your fingers. But nowadays, as you can see, this is not possible. But what is still possible is to work together with Indigenous communities, respecting their connection to the land and their traditional knowledge, to develop nutritious and sustainable value-added products from native plants, herbs, spices, animals, and insects for use in the food and healthcare industries, and create a unique Australian signature product incorporating the knowledge of the First Nation people. Unlocking the First Nation people traditional knowledge creates opportunity for the continuance and revitalization of traditional customary practices that may enable innovative Indigenous business activities and product creation based around food, sustainable natural fiber technology, and health. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Diana. That was marvelous. I mean, it's amazing all the science that's happening right now, isn't it? In this space of food and future food, etc. And it's just so encouraging that we can actually look to such a long history of knowledge to actually to enhance this and to actually bring. It's like we're going around in circles, isn't it? We're going back in time to bring things forward. So,
yeah, exactly.
Just incredible, actually. So thank you very much for sharing that and pointing out that this is going to be a way forward that we need to be thinking about. And I can say that from the point of view of the group that I also represent, separate to the Asian Pacific Copyright Association, but the Indigenous Knowledge Forum group that we have at UTS, we've been working now since 2011 to try and establish what they call sui generis legislation, which or standalone legislation, which focuses only on protecting Indigenous knowledges in Australia, and finding a way forward to establish these databases from the perspective of the communities themselves. So starting from the local community and working the way up, and having ultimately what they call competent authorities to be established to be in charge of how these databases are formed, how the protocols get established and operated, and at the same time answering our obligations internationally to under the Nagoya Protocol of reporting rules from that point of view as well. But what's important is that that it is Indigenous led all the way through, that it's the communities themselves that are actually doing this, and not just others that are from the outside, so to speak. So it's very important that it is done for and by the Indigenous communities themselves. So thank you very much for that. Now let's move on to the panel discussion and the Q&A. Now I have a couple of questions first that I'm going to ask each of you before we move on to the Q&A. So in many ways, I've tried to formulate these questions to be as applicable to all of you to answer as much as possible. Let's start with the first one. So from each of your perspectives, what are the key design issues in establishing these databases and registers of Indigenous knowledges and cultural expressions? What do you need to see happen with the way these sorts of databases or registers are established? Who'd like to start first?
I can go first.
Maybe I would say that we would like they to be accessible for the scientists like us to research on them, to use what is provided, the knowledge that is provided in these databases. But I'm sure that Jerry will have more comprehensive answer.
I think Mary wanted to say something next.
Okay.
Oh no, Jerry, you can go because yours will be far more practical.
Yeah, well, in my experience, especially in Queensland and up this way, they're just very suspicious about any kind of collection of Indigenous knowledge, and they're very reluctant to be involved in this kind of thing. So
yeah.
they would need to know how much protection is there for their knowledge, and will it be protected? You know, if it's going to be, especially if it's on the internet, and that there are ways through the internet that these databases can be accessed. So they're really just concerned about someone just coming in and taking knowledge without their knowledge. As you've seen with the AUSCL people, they just weren't ready to put it on a public platform, and then they decided not to do it until they can get further answers to their questions.
That's understandable. Margaret, Mary, did you want to follow up on that?
Sure. I guess there's a couple of things. One is around the rules and the protocols. So what are the particular regulations around who has access to what? So the broader understanding, but then the technical issues around accessing. So that's either creating password protection or creating those TK labels. If we take a step back and we look at design, the bigger question then, which kind of relates a little bit to what Jane Anderson was saying, is that if we are seeking to embed traditional knowledge within databases, then the database itself needs to be designed in a way that embodies that traditional knowledge. So we can go with the scientific way of establishing a database, which is using the scientific name and connecting particular input fields, or not fields, not the right term, but particular items in certain ways. But if we're using traditional knowledge as the basis for the database, then it may be that you create particular items based on its Indigenous name and the relationship that it has to another species. So instead of going through like all the plant families on a scientific basis, and this obviously, if this traditional knowledge exists, so we know that colonisation's had a horrible impact on Australia, there's a lot of knowledge missing. But I guess what I'm thinking is, and so for science, a family is based on like phenotypes, but for Indigenous knowledge, for some Indigenous knowledge, family is based on the relationship of a plant, an animal, a soil type. Like that's what makes the family for some traditional knowledge. And you could consider the database then being that, as Jerry called it, the ancient database is like being the story house. So you structure the database in a way that replicates what would be an ancient database.
Thank you. Is there space, do you think, then to have, I suppose, two ways that such a database could be developed, so that you have the Indigenous concept of the story, but at the same time have also fields that would be relevant, say, for example, to you know, a patent office that needs to be able to check whether in fact someone is trying to copy the Indigenous knowledge and pass it off as their own. Here I'm raising the idea of what India has done with its traditional knowledge digital library.
I guess it's hard to know how to structure that. So, you know, when we read a novel, and I'll move to another area, when we read a novel, it's one page and we just read the novel. But there have been a number of examples of people writing novels where there's been two stories alongside each other. And that's a way of creating both narratives. So you could have the scientific narrative alongside the Indigenous narrative as a way of showing that this knowledge can be structured in a different way. I don't know how you would do it technically. Yeah, I'm not sure how you would do it. Maybe there would be 2 pages. So if you click on a particular plant species, you can go to the scientific or you can go to an Indigenous page. I'm not sure how you would structure it.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful idea. Thank you for that. Okay, I've got another question for you. So what do you think are the key concerns about the creation of such databases and registers when we recognise that, for example, copyright law grants ownership to the creator of the database separately to any of the existing rights that are over the actual content of the database? So this is getting back to really, Jerry, what your circumstances are concerned about, where the traditional owners are worried about having their information put into a database that perhaps they're not in control of.
Yeah, that's right. And so, I mean, there's a lot of information already out there, and TOs need to be aware of that as well. But if, you know, when we talk about that, they say, well, my ancestors, when they gave that knowledge, they just gave it to help out. They didn't know what was going to be used for. They didn't know that people were going to do research on it and make lots of money out of it. So in the back of their mind, that's what could happen, you know, with these databases. And yeah, they're just very suspicious of databases.
Yeah, understandable. And so we need to find ways to change those concerns and make them work for the traditional owners. And that's not an easy task in itself. Now, I had some more questions, but I'm seeing that we've got quite a few Q&As coming up. So I might actually move on to those questions that have come up. So the first one is, and this is coming from one of the attendees. As a descendant of the stolen generation, I get very frustrated with the fact that non-Indigenous people have greater access to our cultural artefacts and archives than our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community members. It is terrible that government, universities and archive management structures are founded on systemic racism to keep our people under control and stopping us healing from intergenerational trauma and securing treaty and sovereignty. How do we change that at a legislative level? Who'd like to start?
I think given that Indigenous knowledge or cultural artefacts and archives sit across a number of different legislative areas, the legislative reform would have to be either across multiple pieces of legislation, and they're the ones that Natalie outlined in the start. Obviously, I work on the Nagoya Protocol, so I'd really love for the federal government to implement or ratify and implement the Nagoya Protocol. Yeah. The other thing which Natalie has also mentioned is, you know, in lieu of that, then establishing a sui generis legislation, which is what some of the countries in the Pacific Islands have done. So there's traditional knowledge legislation, and that seeks to bring in a lot of the different areas. It won't cover all of them. So there's your 2 options, is to, you know, ratify those international conventions and implement them in legislation nationally, or create a new piece of legislation that can actually seek specifically to fulfill that need.
Thanks, Margaret. Anyone else want to jump in on that? No? Okay, we might move on to the next question then. Let's see. This individual here is a naturopath who would love to get more involved in learning about and supporting the development and preservation of Indigenous foods and medicines. They would also like to learn more about protocols and how to use Indigenous plants as medicines respectfully. What would you all advise would be the best way to get involved?
No one wants to answer. Can I answer that one as well?
Yeah.
So there's the First Nations Bush Foods and Botanical Alliance, which has just been set up, which I think would be a great port of call. I'm also happy to have a chat around protocols, and Daniel Robinson and I both work on it, and also happy to have a chat. The discussion around protocols and being a naturopath, I can't direct you. They're the two places I can direct you for now. I'm not sure where else I can direct you. Thanks.
Thank you. I think what's important, of course, is in making sure that when you do engage, that you are engaging in accordance with what the traditional owners are expecting, making sure that they are providing free, prior, informed consent to imparting any knowledge to you if you're engaging with them from that point of view. But at the same time, and the other element of that which falls under the Nagoya Protocol is in fact this question of benefit sharing and making sure that that benefit sharing is on mutually agreed terms. So that's an important element in any attempt at accessing this knowledge, whether it's through a database or otherwise. And so that's something to keep in mind. So the first element is the free prior informed consent of the community that you're engaging with, and secondly, ensuring that there is benefit sharing arrangement in place that is on mutually agreeable terms. And I think that those key things need to keep in mind. Now, for the third question here, we've got, okay. Hi, everyone. As an aspiring agronomist, I would love to get involved with this. How would be the best way to connect with people to learn more and contribute to growing Indigenous plants? Jerry, maybe you could help with that one.
Probably not really.
Not really? Okay, fair enough.
What I read, actually, they are very difficult to grow because they need special kind of places to be cultivated, and they're prone to the elements. So this is all I know about growing Indigenous plants. Gary, if you say more.
Yeah. So, but also think about connecting what sort of plants you want to grow, and where do they come from. So you have to connect with the traditional owners from where they're already grown naturally, and you make agreements there. It's similar as whether you're a naturopath and you want to do medicines or whatever. You still have to meet with the traditional owners, talk to them about what you want to do. That engagement process first. If you want to get locked into some sort of business activities, that engagement process first, and gaining trust with Indigenous people, and then you can start to talk about what you want to do. And Natalie, you was talking about prior and informed consent and all that. That's where everything is laid on the table. Both sides understand it, and nothing is moved forward or nothing is signed until there is clear understanding of what both sides want to do, and then you can agree to go forward on that, and decide what plants that you do want to grow. But there has to be benefits for Aboriginal people right from the start.
No, I agree with you. One of the elders that's involved with the research that we do at the Indigenous Knowledge Forum, Auntie Fran Bodkin, is a botanist as well, as you know, Jerry. And she's always pointed out the fact that it's really important that you understand not just the individual plant, but also its surroundings and how it grows, because there are synergies between the soil, the insects, the plants and other plants around it that relate to the efficacy of that particular plant being a medicine and being useful as a medicine. So those are the different issues you need to be aware of. And of course, the traditional knowledge holder will know those details, and that's why it's important to engage with them under the terms of the Nagoya Protocol requirements and whatever protocols that particular community has in relation to imparting their knowledge from that point of view. Okay, we've got a few more questions here. In fact, one from Daniel Robinson himself. There we go. What could be the role of traditional knowledge labels or notices within databases and gene banks? This is referring again to Jane Anderson's and Mary Hudson's work. Could these help protect Indigenous data and knowledge and plants, and how do they work? I think you did a bit of that before, Mary, but you might want to expand a bit further on that.
That's a bit of a cheeky question, Dan. They sit within the metadata. There's a new field that you create within the metadata behind the database, but the TK labels themselves and the BC notices, and they're two distinct things. They sit within the, so when you go into a database, so just say you're in a museum and you want to access some information, or like you go into a library database, when that particular item shows up, you'll see like the information, like who's the author, who owns it, and then on the side of it will be the labels, and the labels will tell you what type of access is available for it. And the data associated with that will provide a bit more information about the traditional knowledge owners. Thanks for that.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions to put in here. So how do we all, newcomers and First Peoples, further encourage increasing awareness, respect, acknowledgement, protection, recognition, First Peoples control, intergenerational reproduction and long-term continuity of their respective social, cultural and oral vast ancient knowledges, not necessarily written in texts or DBs, cultured ecosystems, regeneration, etc. How do we achieve this? What would any of you suggest?
Follow protocols.
Follow protocols.
And not only this, probably growing our kids with the knowledge from early age, maybe will be useful.
I think it's through education, isn't it? We need to get out there. I mean, more examples of these sorts of webinars to get out there and explain to people these crucial issues. You know, we could be talking about this for ages, really. I mean, we've only just touched on the very, very basics at this point in time with this webinar. And that brings me to another question here, which basically says, how can government and NGO organisations better support traditional owners, lead data protection, and where agreed knowledge sharing?
Provide funding for that. So it's from experience. Traditional owners, when they look at agreements, sometimes they don't really understand all the jargon. So they need to employ legal advisors to help them, and they haven't got the funding to do that. So some of the funding for research projects don't allow for that, to assist traditional owners to be able to hire somebody and help them explain the agreements and contracts. And then they're kind of sort of left in the lurch. So yeah, funding to help Aboriginal people to, in whatever, you know, legal advice or whatever else they need, to assist them in making these agreements.
Indeed, I wholeheartedly agree about that. And I suppose if we had some overarching legislation, you know, there could be model agreements that are put into place. I know the Environmental Protection and biological diversity conservation legislation at the federal level is supposed to provide for such model agreements, but they're not ideal, and they only cover limited locations where they are actually relevant. I'm not sure about the new Queensland legislation, Jerry, with the Biodiscovery Act being revised recently, whether they've provided any model agreements at all.
Not so much model agreements. It's made improvement to the Act, and no, it's still not 100%, but at least there's improvement there for traditional owners.
That's
regards to their rights.
That's right. Someone has suggested that part of the way of answering one of the earlier questions about how do we get the voice out there is to actually hire our cultural elders to empower the communities to do so, and that's a really important element. I've always found it interesting how you have different government programs in place which speak to engaging with traditional owners and with their knowledge, etc., but they never really talk about it from the point of view of, well, this is actually a consultancy and should be paid for. I mean, it's almost as if it's an expectation that engagement is for free somehow. And I just wonder, if you were KPMG or EY, for example, you'd be expecting to be paid big bucks to give that sort of information. And yet in some of these programs that we've been put in place, there's an expectation that knowledge is imparted without any particular payment whatsoever. So we need to change that for sure. Okay, we've got some more questions here, and then we'll take one more question and we'll wrap up. This is an interesting one. Do you see a use for blockchain or other provenance technologies to protect the use of traditional knowledge?
Can I say something on this? Yes, blockchain has been talked about in this space as being one of the promising technologies that enables you to track provenance in a way that can't be undone. The other technology that's being talked about is also embedding provenance into the DNA of the particular sample, so that when the sample is moved from one location to another and it's being analysed, in the DNA code itself will be the provenance. So the provenance, for those that don't understand the language, is like where it came from and who owns it. The other discussion that's been kind of along the sidelines is around the notion of digital sequencing information. So there's this argument that we don't need the plant samples anymore, we can just sequence it, and that's quite worrying in some ways because it's not necessarily covered by the Nagoya Protocol. But the digital sequencing information, if you're thinking about the use of provenance, and that would be in adding some code into the DSI, which actually includes the provenance information. So yes, it's being talked about. I don't know of any examples just yet, and I also don't know of any examples where provenance has been embedded within DNA, but that's the future of databases. So there are now DNA computers where you can now encode a lot of information without in a different way. So, DNA computers, I think, are the future of this technology in terms of, moving the information around.
That's really very interesting and very very up there, isn't it? The technology.
And this will help with the traceability of all the ingredients as well.
Indeed. Someone was also raising somewhere in the chat NFTs as well as a possible way of doing things. Okay, well, I think we've come to the end of our time here actually, and there's still quite a few questions, but just so that everyone is aware, this has been a recorded session, so it'll be made available online very soon. But it certainly has given us a lot of issues to think about, and may result in of us actually putting on a second session that might take it to the next level on these questions. So thank you everyone for participating today. Now for I suppose the next stages are to really talk about what are the next steps and how we can take that to the next level. As I mentioned beforehand, IP Australia is doing a lot of work on this at the very point in time, and they're trying to deal with it from two perspectives. One, which is to see where existing intellectual property legislation needs to be amended to reflect respect for Indigenous knowledges and culture. And from another perspective, the idea of the introduction of sui generis legislation, which would hopefully cover off on some of the issues that we've been talking about tonight. So before I bring this to a close, there are a couple of things that we want to mention to everyone. I'm going to say a couple of words about the Asian Pacific Copyright Association, and then we'll move on to Dalvin from Hillmore Spark, our wonderful sponsors for tonight, who've managed this whole system for us, to give the vote of thanks. So please join me in thanking our panelists tonight for a wonderful presentation. If we could move on to the next slide, please. Thanks very much for that. Just a quick word about the Asian Pacific Copyright Association that I'm representing this evening. We are an organisation that's been around for 10 years now, and as you can see, covers a wide range of countries. And for people that are interested in copyright and how it operates and how it develops over time, you can see the objectives of APCA put on the slide up there. And it's really very much to promote discussion about copyright and related rights, to promote new legislation and the development of legislation, obviously to contribute to the work of the World Intellectual Property Organization and also the World Trade Organization and UNESCO as bodies that are relevant to copyright. And of course, to ensure the needs and concerns of the people in the Asian Pacific region are taken into consideration when international rules are being developed and changed over time. Our next event is actually coming up next year, so this is the last event for the year, and we're coming up with, as you can see, there's an interesting one there called "Of Supermodels, Pop Princesses and Copyright Trolls, Issues of Fair Use and Personality Rights," and it's being held on the 22nd of February 2022. We have some excellent speakers from around the region talking about the interesting situation of where the paparazzi take photos, but the actual personalities want to use those photos for themselves. So that's going to be an interesting question in itself. The details are forthcoming, so I haven't got that up on a system for Eventbrite or Humanitics yet, but it will be coming soon. And of course, if you want to hear more about the work that the Asian Pacific Copyright Association is doing, you can also join us as well to get further information about upcoming events and our annual conference. So I'll leave it there and pass it on to Dalvin.
Thanks, Annalie. What a great lively discussion. So I've personally learned a great deal about the framing of protocols, the different types of database, the use case for blockchain to preserve the provenance and traceability of data, and of course from you, Diana, the composition and the future of food. Now, before I provide a brief vote of thanks, I wanted to discuss a number of upcoming events organized by the Australian Society for Computers and Law. So we start with a talk tomorrow on the development and deployment of quantum technology and what the law offers to the future of quantum. The Society's very own President Marina, who you heard speak earlier, will be speaking and convening the event, and she'll be joined by a range of distinguished panelists. The Society has also organized two other events. On 17 November, we will have an in-depth conversation with Minister Fletcher on governing in the internet age and the reforms in the space, including reforms in infrastructure, communication, copyright, online, and cyber safety. 2 December is the International Day for the Abolition of Slavery. So on this day, the Society will host a panel session that discusses four questions. First, can we break the chains of modern slavery and the negative impacts on the supply chain? The second question it seeks to address is, could blockchain and other technology be part of the solution, or perhaps could it hinder the solution? I have on the slide links to register and subscribe to these events. If I could then move on to the next slide, Ronnie, which is my vote of thanks. So thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Jerry. And thank you, Diana. As I said, I found this discussion incredibly thought-provoking, and certainly a discussion that I personally hope will continue. We have drivers of change amongst this panelists who will really help drive change that that won't necessarily benefit us, but will benefit our children and the future generation, I hope. So I'm incredibly proud on behalf of Claremore Lawyers to be sponsoring an event like this. Our firm does play a small part in this global discussion, and it does this by advocating the preservation of Indigenous knowledge and protecting the rights of traditional owners, especially in the context of Indigenous art. You will see on the slide a link to the website of our intellectual property and technology team who helps support this work. At the end of our website, we've published a number of data security video series that we recently launched. More importantly, you will see a painting by an artist that we support. This artist's name is Rebecca Treacy. Rebecca is a proud Kittu woman who was born in the small town of Derby in Western Australia. At the age of 6, Rebecca moved with the family to Broome, where she spent her childhood and youth growing up in a close-knit community. Rebecca started painting landscape scenes as a way to not only feel connected to country and her Indigenous heritage, but also as a way to connect to self. This particular painting is proudly displayed in our office and is titled Wandering Country. It's part of a series exploring the connection between land and people, as well as one's own concept of self. This piece was inspired by stories of Rebecca's mum, who was a young girl, grew up in a country on the remote Tableland Station in the East Kimberley. As I said, this painting is displayed in our office in Martin Place if anyone wants to come along and have a look. Now, I'd like to end the evening by once again thanking the panelists and to you, the audience, for attending and contributing to the discussion. Good afternoon, good night, stay safe and stay vigilant. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.